We are often gaslit into believing that history is a chess match played by brilliant tacticians, but that is a comforting fiction. In reality, the timeline of human civilization is mostly a jagged scar left behind by colossal narcissists and absolute morons with far too much authority. From monarchs who physically assaulted the ocean to visionaries who accidentally orchestrated their own demise while chasing the stars, the annals of our past are littered with catastrophic errors in judgment. If you ever feel like a failure for forgetting your keys or missing a deadline, take comfort. You have never been as spectacularly incompetent as the 10 individuals we are about to meet. Number 1. The Vampire Scientist, Alexander Bogdanov. We begin with a man who was literally consumed by his own irony. Alexander Bogdanov was a titan of the Russian Revolution, a philosopher, and a science fiction pioneer. However, his most dangerous obsession wasn't political, it was biological. Bogdanov became convinced that the fountain of youth wasn't a myth, but a fluid. He believed that the secret to physical immortality lay in blood exchanges, the literal swapping of blood between the young and the old. Bogdanov didn't just write about this, he founded a state institute for it. After his first few transfusions, he claimed his hair stopped falling out and his vision improved. It was likely a textbook case of the placebo effect, but to a man blinded by his own genius, it was proof of concept. In 1928, he decided to perform his 12th transfusion, selecting a student to swap fluids with. There was one minor detail. The student was currently suffering from both malaria and tuberculosis. Bogdanov, in a display of breathtaking arrogance, believed his own superblood would act as a natural filter, neutralizing the pathogens. He was wrong. He died a slow, agonizing death shortly after, proving that while you can be a visionary leader, you cannot philosophy your way out of systemic septicemia. He chased eternal life and found a very preventable grave. Number 2. The man who chose a donkey over a dynasty, Spiridon Louis. Imagine being handed a blank check by a king and using it to buy a stapler. That is the fiscal legacy of Spiridon Louis. In 1896, this humble Greek water carrier became a global sensation by winning the first ever marathon of the modern Olympic Games. The nation of Greece went absolutely feral with pride. King George I was so moved by the victory that he summoned Spiridon and gave him a wish list offer: land, gold, a pension for life, or a prestigious government title. This was the moment to secure generational wealth and change his family's lineage forever. Spiridon, however, was a man of simple, perhaps too simple, needs. He looked at the king and asked for a new mule and a cart to make his water delivery route a little easier on his legs. While history remembers him as a paragon of humility, from a financial perspective, it is one of the most facepalm-inducing decisions ever recorded. He turned down a literal kingdom for the 19th century equivalent of a used pickup truck. He won the race, but he definitely lost the negotiation. Number 3. The Sniper King, Otto of Bavaria. King Otto of Bavaria truly puts the mad in monarch. Ascending the throne in the late 19th century, Otto wasn't exactly what you'd call a public servant. In fact, he spent his entire 27-year reign legally insane, locked away inside a castle, while a regent handled the actual business of the state. But Otto didn't just sit in a room staring at the wallpaper. He developed a terrifyingly active hobby to kill the boredom. He would stand at his high castle window with a loaded hunting rifle and take pot shots at unsuspecting peasants walking on the road below. His view of leadership was that his subjects were literal moving targets. Eventually, the royal caretakers grew tired of the mounting body count and the PR nightmare of a king murdering his own tax base. They secretly replaced his live ammunition with blanks. Otto spent the rest of his life shooting at people, wondering why they were suddenly bulletproof, proving that sometimes the crown rests on a head that is structurally empty. Number 4. The man who bought an empire on credit, Didius Julianus. History is full of men seizing power through blood and iron, but Didius Julianus is the only man who tried to buy it like a used sedan. In the year 193 AD, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, the Praetorian Guard, the elite bodyguards of Rome, murdered the sitting emperor and decided the fairest way to choose a successor was to auction off the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. Didius showed up and started a bidding war against another wealthy senator. He eventually won by promising 25,000 sestertians to every single soldier in the guard. He essentially bought the title of emperor on a massive credit card he couldn't afford to pay off. The problem with buying an empire is that you cannot buy the loyalty of the people or the respect of the generals. The Roman citizens treated him like a joke. The army refused to acknowledge his receipt for the throne, and his reign lasted a pathetic 66 days. When a rival general finally marched on Rome, the very soldiers Didius had bought refused to fight for him. He is executed in the palace, learning the hard way that a title bought at auction doesn't come with a warranty.
Number 5. The $7 million Icebox, Tsar Alexander II. This might be the single worst real estate deal in human history. In 1867, Tsar Alexander II looked at the map of Russia and saw Alaska as a massive, frozen liability. It was difficult to defend, expensive to manage, and he was convinced it was just a useless block of ice. Desperate for cash, he sold the entire territory to the United States for $7.2 million. At the time, that was roughly 2 cents per acre. The American public actually mocked the deal, calling it Seward's folly and a waste of taxpayer money. However, the Tsar's decision would go down as a catastrophic geopolitical blunder. Only a few decades later, massive gold rushes and the discovery of some of the largest oil reserves on the planet turned that useless icebox into a multi-trillion-dollar asset. Russia effectively traded away one of the most resource-rich regions on Earth and a vital strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere for the price of a few dozen fancy dinner parties. Number 6. Poking the Dragon, Shah Muhammad II. There is an old rule in diplomacy: do not poke the bear. Shah Muhammad II, ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, decided to ignore that and instead poke the dragon, the tiger, and a nuclear bomb simultaneously. When Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan and diplomats to the Shah to establish peaceful trade relations, the Shah made a fatal error. He arrested the caravan and executed the Khan's ambassadors. To understand the scale of this stupidity, you have to realize that Genghis Khan was actually trying to be a peaceful neighbor for once. But after the insult of seeing his messengers returned in pieces, the Khan went into a mode of total annihilation. He didn't just invade, he systematically erased the Shah's empire from the face of the earth. He diverted rivers to drown the Shah's birthplace and killed millions of people in a campaign of vengeance that redefined the word brutality. The Shah spent his final days dying of pleurisy on a lonely island in the Caspian Sea, realizing too late that being the tough guy against the Mongols was the last mistake he would ever make. Number 7. The man who canceled Christmas, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is the primary reason the British eventually decided that having a king wasn't so bad after all. After leading the parliamentarians to victory in the English Civil War, Cromwell became Lord Protector and decided that the secret to a moral society was to make sure no one ever had a second of fun. Cromwell was the ultimate historical buzzkill. He used his military power to ban theater, sports, makeup, and most infamously, he literally canceled Christmas. He viewed festive celebrations as pagan and sinful. He sent soldiers into the streets to sniff out roasting turkeys. If a house looked too happy or festive, the food was confiscated and the owners were punished. He turned England into a miserable gray dictatorship of mandatory boredom. He was so intensely hated that 3 years after he died, when the monarchy was restored, the government actually dug up his rotting corpse, put it on a physical trial for treason, and hung the skeleton in public. You know you were a failed leader when people are still lining up to execute you years after your heart has stopped beating.
Number 8. The Royal Getaway in a Monster Truck. Louis XVI. If you were planning to flee a violent revolution in the middle of the night, you might want to consider being subtle. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, however, decided to treat their escape from Paris in 1791 like a luxury vacation. Instead of taking small, fast, inconspicuous carriages, they insisted on a massive, custom-built berline coach. This thing was the 18th century equivalent of a gold-plated stretch limo. It was heavy, slow, and painted to look as expensive as possible. To make matters worse, the king insisted on stopping for long, multi-course lunches and even stepped out to stretch his legs in public view. Because he moved at the pace of a tectonic plate, he was eventually recognized by a postmaster who compared the king's face to the portrait on a coin in his pocket. The royal family was arrested just miles from the border and hauled back to Paris to meet the guillotine. It wasn't an escape plan, it was a suicide mission with snacks. Number 9. Paying the Bully, Ethelred the Unready. Most historical nicknames sound powerful, like the Conqueror or the Great. King Ethelred, however, got stuck with the Unready. This is actually a pun on his name, meaning noble counsel, who received no counsel. Faced with a massive Viking invasion, Ethelred decided to use a strategy that every bullied kid in middle school knows doesn't work. He paid them lunch money to go away. He handed over massive amounts of silver, known as Danegeld, believing the Vikings would take the cash and go home. Spoiler, they didn't. The Vikings quickly realized that England was essentially a giant, undefended ATM. They would take the silver, go home for the winter, and return the following spring with more boats and more men to demand a raise. Ethelred managed to bankrupt his entire kingdom while funding the very army that was slowly destroying it. He paid for a peace that he never intended to fight for, proving that you can't buy off a shark with a bucket of chum. Number 10. The One-Man Apocalypse, Thomas Midgley, Jr. We conclude with a man who managed to cause more damage to the planet than every fictional supervillain combined. Thomas Midgley, Jr. was a chemist with a knack for inventing things that the Earth absolutely hated. First, he invented leaded gasoline. To stop car engines from knocking, he added tetraethyl lead to fuel, which proceeded to pump a neurotoxin into the atmosphere that literally lowered the average IQ of the entire human race for decades. When lead started making people visibly sick, he didn't stop. He pivoted to inventing CFCs, Freon, for refrigerators. This invention was directly responsible for tearing a massive hole in the Earth's ozone layer. Midgley is a one-man environmental disaster. However, the universe eventually served him a final ironic dish. After contracting polio and losing the use of his legs, he used his inventor brain to build a complex system of motorized ropes and pulleys to lift himself out of bed. In a final twist of mechanical failure, he became entangled in his own ropes and was strangled to death by his own invention. He spent his life trying to control the environment and ended up being taken out by a poorly designed pulley system. That was 10 reasons why we are lucky to still be here. We've survived centuries of catastrophic idiocy by the skin of our teeth. But I want to hear from you. Which of these failures do you think had the biggest impact on the world today? And be honest in the comments. Do you think humanity is actually getting any smarter, or are we just finding more high-tech ways to be stupid? Drop your arguments below, smash that like button if you've never accidentally sold a country, and subscribe to keep your brain from becoming a military blunder.